Tonight, we unravel a story that proves truth is more powerful than greed, and destiny finds its way through the most gilded cages. It begins in the heart of New York City, inside a restaurant where a billion-dollar deal is being sealed. The man at the table is Alexander Sterling, a titan of industry whose heart is colder than the ice in his glass. The woman serving him is Evelyn Reed, a waitress whose life is a daily battle for survival. They are strangers, separated by a chasm of wealth and power. But a single accidental gesture, the slip of a sleeve, is about to shatter that illusion and unleash a storm of secrets, betrayal, and a love that has waited a lifetime to be remembered. Prepare yourselves, because the sound of this breaking glass will echo through generations. The air in the gilded quill was thick with the scent of money and seared scallops. It was an atmosphere Alexander Sterling cultivated and commanded not just in his boardrooms, but in every facet of his life. Perched on the 64th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, the restaurant was a theater of power, and tonight he was its director. Across the table sat Mr. Kenji Tanaka, a Japanese tech mogul whose company was the final gleaming jewel Alexander needed for the crown of his conglomerate, Sterling Industries. The deal, worth a staggering $9 billion, was all but done. All that remained was the ceremonial clinking of glasses. Alexander was a man forged in ice and ambition. His tailored Tom Ford suit fit him like a second skin, sharp and unforgiving. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, missed nothing. They swept the room with a dismissive air, cataloguing the lesser predators and their prey. He was 34, but the grief and responsibility he'd carried for 2 decades had carved premature lines of austerity around his mouth. He was respected, feared, but not loved. Love was a currency he had no use for. It had been buried long ago in the smoldering wreckage of his past. "Your proposal is aggressive, Sterling-san," Mr. Tanaka said, his voice a low, smooth purr that belied the sharpness of his mind. Alexander offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Growth is never achieved through passivity, Tanaka-san. We don't follow the market. We create it." He lifted his glass of Yamazaki 18, the amber liquid catching the light of the city below. "To creation." Tanaka nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. He raised his own glass. "To creation." It was at that precise suspended moment that Evelyn Reed approached their table. She moved with a practiced, unobtrusive grace, born of years spent navigating crowded rooms while balancing the desires of the wealthy. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pulled back in a tight professional bun, and her face held a mask of polite neutrality. Inside, however, a quiet panic was simmering. Her adoptive mother, Sarah, had another round of treatments starting next week, and the bill was a mountain she had no idea how to climb. This job, with its meager tips from men who wore her yearly salary on their wrists, was the only rope she had. She was there to clear the appetizer plates. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she murmured, her voice soft, so as not to intrude on the monumental conversation. Alexander barely registered her presence. She was part of the background, like the soft jazz or the distant city lights. He was focused on Tanaka's hand, on the way his fingers tightened around his glass, a sign of imminent agreement. The deal was his. Evelyn reached across the table for Alexander's plate. As she did, the starched cuff of her white sleeve slid back an inch, perhaps 2. It was a tiny, insignificant movement, but it exposed the delicate skin of her inner wrist. And there, against the pale canvas of her skin, was a birthmark. It wasn't a simple splotch of pigment. It was a perfect deep crimson crescent moon, and nestled within its curve was a single tiny dot like a solitary star, a lunar cradle. Time did not slow down for Alexander Sterling. It fractured. The low hum of the restaurant, the murmur of Tanaka's voice, the distant wail of a siren from the streets below, it all vanished. His universe collapsed into that one square inch of skin. His mind, usually a fortress of cold logic and calculated risks, was suddenly a storm of chaotic, visceral memory. A little girl's laughter in a sun-drenched garden. A tiny hand, his hand tracing the strange and beautiful mark on his baby sister's wrist. "It's our secret map, Anya," he'd whispered, his voice full of childish importance. "A moon and a star just for you." The screech of tires, the horrifying crunch of metal, the world turning upside down, a kaleidoscope of shattered glass and screaming. Fire. Smoke. His father shouting her name. Anastasia. He remembered the chaos, the frantic search, the police officers with grim faces. She was gone. Vanished from the scene of the car crash that had claimed their parents. A 5-year-old girl with a crescent moon and a star on her wrist swallowed by the world. The Yamazaki glass, forgotten, slipped from his numb fingers. It didn't just fall. It seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before plummeting downwards. The sound of it striking the polished marble floor was not a crash, but an explosion. It ripped through the restaurant's hushed reverence, a gunshot in a library. Every head turned. Mr. Tanaka flinched back, a splash of priceless whiskey spotting his tie. Waitstaff froze mid-stride. Evelyn gasped, pulling her arm back as if she'd been burned. Her eyes, wide with shock and fear, flew to Alexander's face. She expected anger, a cold dismissal, the fury of a powerful man inconvenienced. She saw none of it. The mask of the billionaire CEO was gone. In its place was a raw, gaping wound of a man. His face was utterly devoid of color, his stormy eyes wide with a terrifying, ghost-like horror. His lips were parted, but no sound came out. He wasn't looking at the shattered glass or the spreading puddle of whiskey. He was staring with an intensity that felt like it was peeling back her skin at her wrist. The moment stretched taut and unbearable. The restaurant manager, a perpetually nervous man named Jeffrey, rushed over his face, a mess of apologies. "Mr. Sterling, my deepest apologies. We will take care of this immediately. Are you all right, sir?" Alexander didn't hear him. He heard a ghost's laughter. He saw a secret map. He pushed his chair back with such force that it screeched against the floor and nearly toppled over. He stood up, his towering frame trembling, a single choked word escaping his lips. A name that hadn't been spoken aloud in his presence for 20 years. Anastasia. The name hung in the air, an impossible question, a desperate prayer. Evelyn stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest, a profound and terrifying confusion washing over her. She had no idea who Anastasia was. But in the broken depths of this powerful stranger's eyes, she saw a reflection of her own lifelong question. Who am I? The collision was complete. Two worlds separated by a lifetime of secrets had just shattered on the floor of the Gilded Quill. The days following the incident at the restaurant were a blur of controlled chaos for Alexander. On the surface, he was the epitome of command. He'd had his security chief Marcus Vance smoothly handle the situation, placating Mr. Tanaka with an apology so profound and an offer so generous that the $9 billion deal was salvaged by dawn. The official story, whispered among the city's elite, was that Mr. Sterling had suffered a momentary, stress-induced dizzy spell, a plausible, if uncharacteristic, explanation. But inside the silent, minimalist expanse of his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Alexander was unraveling. The fortress he had built around his heart for 2 decades had been breached not by a corporate rival or a market crash, but by a ghost in a waitress's uniform. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. The image of that birthmark was seared onto the inside of his eyelids, the crescent moon and its solitary star. He would pace the length of his vast living room, the city lights a glittering, indifferent tapestry below, and the memories would come in waves, relentless and cruel. He was 14 when the crash happened. It was a rainy October night. They were returning from their grandparents' estate in Connecticut. He remembered arguing with his father a trivial teenage rebellion about a curfew. His mother was humming a soft lullaby to 5-year-old Anastasia Anya, who was already asleep in her car seat. Her little head, with its halo of blonde curls, was resting against the window, her tiny hand clutching a worn stuffed bear. He could still see the birthmark on her wrist in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Then came the headlights, blinding and monstrous, from a truck that had swerved into their lane. The world became a symphony of destruction. When he came to hanging upside down from his seatbelt, the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and rain. His parents were gone, their lives extinguished in an instant. He had unbuckled himself, his body a map of pain, and scrambled to the back. The rear door was mangled, torn open. Anya's car seat was empty. Her stuffed bear lay on the wet asphalt 20 feet away. She was just gone. The police investigation had been massive, fueled by the Sterling family's immense wealth and influence. They theorized that in the chaotic aftermath, a passerby might have pulled her from the wreckage before the first responders arrived. A kidnapping for ransom was the leading theory, but there was never a call, never a demand. It was as if Anastasia Sterling had evaporated into the rain-slicked night. The search consumed Alexander's uncle, Richard Sterling, his father's younger brother, who became Alexander's legal guardian. It consumed the family fortune. Private investigators chased down hundreds of dead ends, from supposed sightings in distant states to cruel hoaxes by heartless opportunists. For years, every blonde-haired little girl on the street would make Alexander's heart seize in his chest. Eventually, the world moved on. The investigators filed their final inconclusive reports. Richard declared that for Alexander's sake, they had to accept the tragedy and look to the future. But Alexander never did. He channeled his grief, his rage, his guilt. Why had he been arguing with his father? Why hadn't he been watching her into building an empire? Sterling Industries became his obsession, a monument of steel and glass built on a foundation of loss. Each acquisition, each victory, was a distraction from the hollow ache in his soul. He had everything a man could want, and he had nothing that mattered. Now this waitress, Evelyn Reed. He sat at his obsidian desk, a file open on the holographic display before him. It was the preliminary report from Marcus. He'd been working around the clock since that night. The file was thin, the life it described painfully ordinary. Evelyn Reed, age 25. Orphaned. Records of her arrival at the St. Jude's Foundling Home in Queens were vague. She was dropped off as a toddler, approximately 2 years old, with no identifying information, save for a first name, Evie, pinned to her blanket. She was fostered and later adopted by Sarah Reed, a kind working-class woman who was now suffering from chronic renal failure. Evelyn had no criminal record. She had a mountain of debt, mostly medical. She had worked a series of low-paying service jobs since she was 16. Her life was a portrait of quiet desperation. There was nothing in the file to suggest a connection to the Sterling dynasty. Nothing at all, except for the birthmark. It could be a coincidence, Alex Marcus Vance said, his voice a calm, steady presence through the speakerphone. Marcus was more than head of security. He was the only person Alexander trusted. A former Special Forces operative, he had been with the family for 15 years and was fiercely loyal. Statistically, it's not impossible for two people to have similar marks. Similar. Alexander's voice was rough. Marcus, it was identical. The curve of the moon, the placement of the star. It was hers. It was Anya's. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture ragged. I see it in my dreams. I've seen it every night for 20 years. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus knew the story. He had been the one to personally vet and dismiss dozens of women over the years who had come forward, claiming to be Anastasia, all of them frauds, seeking a piece of the Sterling fortune. What do you want me to do? Marcus asked, his tone shifting from skeptical friend to efficient employee. Alexander stared at the photo of Evelyn on the screen. It was a candid shot taken from a distance. She was walking down the street, a bag of groceries in her arms, a weary look on her face. There was a softness to her features, a hint of his mother's jawline, perhaps. Or was he just projecting his desperate hope onto a stranger's face? Her hair was brown, not the sunny blonde of Anya's childhood curls. But hair color could change. Her eyes, he couldn't make out their color. I want to know everything, Alexander commanded. Her entire life story. I want to know who her friends are, what she eats for breakfast, what she dreams about at night. I want you to find the person who dropped her off at that orphanage. Dig into the police reports from the night of the crash, the ones that went cold. Cross-reference every John and Jane Doe admission at every hospital in a 100-mile radius for the months following the accident. I want to know if this is a ghost, or if she's real. And what about her? Marcus asked carefully. What do you want me to do about Evelyn Reed Alexander's first instinct? The CEO's instinct was to control the situation, to summon her, to interrogate her, to demand answers. But the broken man inside the boy who had lost his sister knew that was the wrong move. If she was Anastasia, she would have no memory of him. She would be a stranger, frightened and overwhelmed. If she was a fraud, a direct confrontation would only give her ammunition. Approach her. Alexander said, his voice low and measured. Be discreet. Find a pretense. I need one thing from her. One thing that will end this one way or another. A DNA sample. Marcus stated not as a question. Yes, Alexander confirmed. Get me a sample. My DNA is on file. We can have the results from a private lab within 48 hours. He closed the file, the screen going dark. But Evelyn's face remained a phantom image on the black glass. 48 hours. In 48 hours, he would either be reunited with the only piece of his past that mattered, or he would have to bury his sister all over again. The hope was a poison sweet and terrifying. It was the most vulnerable he had felt in 20 years, and he hated it as much as he craved it. The echo of a ghost had become a roar, and it threatened to either save him or shatter him completely. The first casualty of the shattered whiskey glass was Evelyn's job. Jeffrey, the manager of the Gilded Quill, had fired her the next day. His apology was profuse, almost tearful, but his decision was absolute. Mr. Sterling is our most important client, he'd explained, avoiding her eyes. The incident, It was a disruption. We can't risk any further complications. Evelyn didn't argue. She knew what complications meant. It meant her. She was a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of his world. She packed her few belongings from her locker, the paltry tips from the night before, feeling like severance pay from a life she was already forgetting. Walking out into the bright afternoon sun, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. It wasn't just about the money. The billionaire's reaction, that single whispered name, Anastasia, had unsettled something deep within her. It was a key turning in a lock she never knew existed. Her life was a collection of unanswered questions. Her earliest memory wasn't of a mother or a father, but of the cold linoleum floor of the St. Jude's foundling home. She had no history, no roots, just a name pinned to a blanket and a birthmark on her wrist. Sarah Reed. The woman who adopted her had given her all the love in the world, but she couldn't give her a past. Now that past seemed to be reaching for her, not with gentle hands, but with the force of a corporate takeover. A few days later, the scrutiny began. It started subtly. A black sedan always parked across the street from her small apartment building in Astoria. The feeling of being watched as she walked to the pharmacy to pick up Sarah's prescriptions. A man in a simple grey suit asking her neighbors questions about her, claiming to be from a market research firm. Her simmering anxiety finally boiled over when the man from the sedan approached her directly. It happened as she was leaving the hospital after visiting Sarah. He was tall, with a calm, impassive face and eyes that seemed to absorb everything without judgment. He wasn't threatening, but the quiet competence that radiated from him was more intimidating than any overt display of aggression. "Miss Evelyn Reed?" he asked. His voice was calm and professional. "Who's asking?" Evelyn clutched her purse, her knuckles white. "My name is Marcus Vance. I represent a client who has taken an interest in your situation." "My situation," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her. "You mean my jobless, in-debt situation?" "Who's your client?" "The man from the restaurant, Mr. Sterling." Marcus gave a slight nod. "Mr. Sterling was very concerned by the circumstances of your recent termination of employment. He feels responsible. He would like to make amends." Evelyn's suspicion sharpened. Billionaires didn't make amends to waitresses they indirectly got fired. They moved on without a second thought. "I don't want his money," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "This is not about a simple cash settlement," Miss Reed, Marcus said smoothly. "This is a business proposition. It is unconventional." He gestured to a nearby coffee shop. "Perhaps we could discuss it somewhere more comfortable." Against her better judgment, she agreed. Inside, sitting in a worn vinyl booth, Marcus laid out the offer. It was as bizarre as it was insulting. Mr. Sterling was willing to pay her $250,000. It was a life-changing amount of money. Enough to pay off all of Sarah's medical debt and ensure her care for years to come. In exchange for one thing, a simple cheek swab for a day test. Evelyn stared at him dumbfounded. A day test? Why? What on earth? For my client has his reasons. Marcus said, his face unreadable. They are of a personal nature. Personal. He looks at my wrist, shatters a glass. Whispers a name I've never heard. Gets me fired, and now he wants my DNA for personal reasons. That's not a business proposition, Mr. Vance. That's an invasion of privacy. She felt a surge of anger. Does he think I'm some kind of long-lost princess? Is that it? Mr. Sterling is simply trying to resolve a very old and very painful question, Marcus said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. The money is not a payment for your DNA. It is compensation for your cooperation and for the distress this situation has caused you. It will be placed in an escrow account and released to you the moment the sample is collected, regardless of the outcome of the test. Evelyn was torn. Her pride screamed at her to walk away, to tell this man and his mysterious, powerful boss to leave her alone. But the image of Sarah's tired face, the constant worry in her eyes about being a burden, was a powerful counter-argument. $250,000. It wasn't just money. It was peace of mind. It was a future for the only mother she had ever known. "What if I say no?" she asked. "Then we will of course respect your decision," Marcus replied. "Mr. Sterling will still provide a severance package for your lost job, and we will trouble you no further." It was the lack of pressure that made the offer so tempting. He wasn't coercing her. He was giving her a choice between her privacy and her mother's security. For Evelyn, it was never really a choice at all. "Fine," she said the word, tasting like defeat. "When a nurse can meet you at a private clinic of your choice, tomorrow morning if that's agreeable." Evelyn nodded numbly, her mind reeling. As she left the coffee shop, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just sold a piece of herself. Meanwhile, news of the incident at the Gilded Quill had traveled faster than Marcus's carefully crafted cover story. It reached the ears of Richard Sterling, Alexander's uncle, and a senior board member at Sterling Industries. Richard was a man who wore his familial devotion like a well-tailored suit, but underneath his heart was curdled with a resentment he'd nursed for decades. He had lived in his older brother's shadow his whole life, and after his death, he'd been forced to watch his nephew, a mere boy, inherit an empire. He had played the part of the supportive, grieving uncle perfectly. He had overseen the search for Anastasia, his face a mask of public anguish. But secretly, her disappearance had been a blessing. With his brother and sister-in-law gone, and Anastasia vanished, the vast trust fund set up for her had fallen under his management until she was declared legally dead or turned 25. For 20 years, Richard had been carefully and methodically siphoning funds from that trust, building his own hidden fortune, covering his gambling debts, and funding a lifestyle far beyond his official salary. The news of a waitress with a specific birthmark shaking his nephew to his core sent a jolt of pure terror through him. He made a few calls. He learned about the firing, about Marcus Vance's discreet inquiries, and about the proposed DNA test. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. If that girl was Anastasia, his life was over. The embezzlement would be discovered. He would face financial ruin, public humiliation, and prison. He had to stop it. He couldn't prevent the test from happening, that would be too suspicious. But he could control the outcome. He picked up a burner phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It connected him to a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, the director of a high-end private genetics lab, a man whose own gambling habits had once put him deep in Richard's debt. "Finch, Richard," said his voice a low hiss. "I have a job for you. A matter of the utmost sensitivity. I'm going to need you to lose a file and create a new one." The ghost of Anastasia Sterling wasn't just a threat to Alexander's peace. It was a wrecking ball aimed directly at the fraudulent foundation of Richard's entire life. And he would do anything to keep it from striking. The clinic was a sterile, impersonal place in a quiet midtown building, chosen for its discretion. Evelyn sat on the edge of an examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her. A pleasant middle-aged nurse had taken the swab from her cheek with a brisk professional efficiency. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to trade a piece of her biological identity for a fortune. As the nurse sealed the sample in a biohazard bag labeled with a long alphanumeric code, Evelyn felt a profound hollowness. Marcus Vance was waiting for her in the lobby. He handed her a tablet. On the screen was a document from a law firm confirming the transfer of $250,000 into an account she had set up the day before. It was real. The numbers shimmered on the screen, a digital promise of a different life. "Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Reed, Marcus," said, his expression as neutral as ever. "You will be notified of the results as soon as they are available, as per our agreement. After that, we will trouble you no further." Evelyn just nodded, unable to speak. She walked out of the clinic and into the anonymity of the city, feeling like a ghost in her own life. The money was a heavy weight in her mind, a source of both immense relief and suffocating guilt. For Alexander, the next 48 hours were an exercise in exquisite torture. He locked himself in his penthouse, cancelling all meetings. He refused all calls except for the secure line to Marcus. The hope he'd tried to suppress was now a raging fire. He allowed himself for the first time in years to imagine it. To imagine telling Anya about their parents, showing her photos, sharing the few happy memories he clung to. He imagined the end of his profound, crushing loneliness. The prospect was so beautiful it was agonizing. The sample, carefully transported by one of Marcus's most trusted couriers, arrived at the Pentec Genetics Laboratory. It was logged, processed, and assigned to a senior technician. But before the analysis could begin, Dr. Alistair Finch intercepted it. Finch was a man sweating under the weight of his own bad decisions. Richard Sterling's call had resurrected a fear he thought he'd long since buried. He owed the man, and Richard was not the kind of creditor who accepted late payments. With trembling hands, Finch accessed the system. He located Alexander Sterling's DNA profile on file, a sample given years ago for the company's executive health program. He then found the sample from the anonymous donor, Evelyn Reed. The work was terrifyingly simple. He didn't need to run the test at all. He just needed to create a report. He pulled up a template for a familial DNA comparison. He fabricated the data points, inputting markers that would show zero correlation. He triple-checked the codes to ensure they matched the samples provided. Then, with a click of a button, he generated the official report. Paternal and maternal markers analyzed. Conclusion. The probability of a sibling relationship between subject A Sterling A and subject B Reed E is 0.00%. The subjects are genetically unrelated. He sent the encrypted file to Marcus Vance's secure email address, and then with another series of keystrokes, permanently deleted the raw data logs of the incoming sample from Evelyn Reed. It was as if she had never been tested. He leaned back in his leather chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was done. The notification on Alexander's phone chimed like a death knell. He opened the email from Marcus. The report was attached as a secure PDF. His hands shook as he tapped it open. He didn't need to read the complex genetic sequencing data. He just saw the conclusion, the cold, clinical words in stark black and white. 0.00%. Genetically unrelated. The fire of hope within him was extinguished in an instant, leaving behind nothing but cold black ash. The penthouse which moments before had felt charged with possibility was suddenly a vast, empty tomb. The silence was deafening. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. The CEO, the titan of industry, simply folded. The grief held at bay for 2 days came back with the force of a tsunami dragging him under. It was worse than before. Before there was the faint, desperate glimmer of the unknown. There was always the what if. Now there was certainty. She wasn't Anastasia. She was a random waitress, a statistical anomaly, a cruel joke played on him by a capricious universe. The pain was so intense, so physical, it felt like the car crash was happening all over again. His sorrow quickly curdled into a familiar, protective anger. He had allowed himself to be vulnerable. He had opened that door to the past, and a cold wind had blown through, chilling him to the bone. He felt foolish, exposed, and his anger, with nowhere else to go, settled on the image of Evelyn Reed. He knew logically that she had done nothing wrong. She hadn't sought him out. He had pursued her. But in his pain-ravaged mind, her face was now inextricably linked to this fresh wave of devastation. She was a living reminder of his failure, of his loss. He picked up the phone and called Marcus. His voice was devoid of all emotion, a flat, dead thing. "It's done," he said. "Alex, I'm sorry," Marcus began, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. "Don't be Alexander," cut him off. "It is what it is. I want to finalize the payment to Miss Reed. Include an additional 50,000 for the emotional distress. Draft a letter to accompany it. State that while the test results were negative, the funds are hers to keep as promised. Make it clear, however, that she is to sign a non-disclosure agreement and is to make no attempt under any circumstances to contact me or any representative of Sterling Industries ever again. Is that understood?" "Understood," Marcus said quietly. "And Marcus." Alexander added his voice, dropping even lower. "I want her file deleted. I don't want to see her name or her face again." Evelyn received the letter and the final confirmation of the funds the next day. The legal language of the NDA was dense and intimidating, but the message was clear. Take the money and disappear. The results of the test were stated in a single blunt sentence. She wasn't who he thought she was. A part of her, a tiny foolish part she hadn't even admitted to herself, felt a strange pang of disappointment. For a fleeting moment she had wondered if she might finally belong somewhere. But the relief washed over her almost immediately. The ordeal was over. She was free, and she was rich beyond her wildest dreams. The first thing she did was call her mother's doctor and arrange to pay for a kidney transplant from a private donor list, a procedure that had previously been an impossible fantasy. She signed the papers, took the money, and obediently vanished. Alexander Sterling went back to building his empire, his heart now shielded by another layer of impenetrable ice. And in his office, Richard Sterling poured himself a celebratory glass of scotch, believing he had successfully buried a ghost for the second time. The deception was complete, and the truth lay dormant, waiting for a chance to claw its way back into the light. 6 months passed. The city moved from the crisp chill of autumn to the deep freeze of winter, and began its slow thaw into spring. Life, as it always does, went on. For Evelyn, it transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The money from Alexander Sterling had been a miracle. Sarah got her transplant, and the surgery was a resounding success. For the first time in years, the color returned to her cheeks, and the oppressive cloud of illness lifted from their small apartment. Evelyn didn't have to run herself ragged waiting tables anymore. She enrolled in an online course for graphic design, nurturing a long-dormant creative talent. They moved to a brighter, more comfortable apartment with a small balcony where Sarah could tend to her potted plants. On the surface, everything was perfect. She had security, her mother was healthy, and the future was a canvas of possibility. Yet a quiet restlessness hummed beneath the surface of her new life. The encounter with Alexander Sterling had left an indelible mark. The negative DNA test should have been the end of it, a definitive closing of a bizarre chapter. But it hadn't felt like an ending. It felt like a page torn from the middle of a book. Why had he been so certain? What had he seen in her face, on her wrist, that had shaken a man like that to his core? The whispered name Anastasia would sometimes drift into her thoughts at quiet moments, a name that felt both alien and strangely familiar. One rainy Saturday afternoon, while helping Sarah clear out an old storage closet, she stumbled upon a small, dusty cardboard box. It was filled with the few items she'd arrived with at St. Jude's, the threadbare blanket, a pair of tiny, worn-out shoes, and a few other trinkets the nuns had kept for her. She had looked through it a dozen times as a child, hoping for a clue that was never there. This time, however, her fingers brushed against something hard and cool at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of faded flannel. She unwrapped it. It was a small, tarnished silver locket, oval-shaped and smooth to the touch. The clasp was stiff, but she managed to pry it open. Inside were two tiny, faded photographs, protected behind clouded plastic. On the left was a young boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with serious, stormy grey eyes and dark hair. He was looking at the camera with a protective, almost stern expression. On the right was a baby no more than a year old, with a tuft of bright blonde hair, swaddled in a white blanket. The baby's tiny hand was visible, and even in the faded, minuscule photo, Evelyn could just make out a dark speck on the inner wrist. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the boy's face. The eyes. She had seen those eyes before. They were Alexander Sterling's eyes. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. It was impossible. The DNA test was negative. It had to be a coincidence. But it was too specific, too potent. A boy who looked like him, a baby with a mark like hers. It felt like a message from a past she couldn't access. As she stared at the locket, her mind drifted, and a faint, fragmented melody surfaced from the deep recesses of her memory. It was a simple, soothing tune, a lullaby without words. She found herself humming it under her breath, a habit she'd had since childhood, whenever she was anxious or thoughtful. She had never known where it came from. Across the city, in the sterile quiet of Sterling Industries' 80th floor executive offices, Marcus Vance was also wrestling with the past. He was a man who believed in facts and evidence, and the lab report had been definitive. He had followed his boss's orders and deleted the Evelyn Reed file. But a good soldier always checks his six, and a good security chief never fully trusts a situation that resolves itself too neatly. Something about the whole affair had bothered him. It was Richard Sterling. Alexander's uncle had been almost too supportive after the negative result. He'd clapped Alexander on the back, telling him it was for the best, that it was time to finally let the ghost of Anastasia rest. It felt performative, disingenuous. On a hunch, operating on his own time and with his own resources, Marcus began a quiet, off-the-books inquiry. He didn't look into Evelyn. He looked into the lab. He ran a deep financial background check on its director, Dr. Alistair Finch. What he found was a history of significant gambling debt, most of which had been mysteriously settled about 5 years ago. Digging deeper, Marcus uncovered the source of the payoff, a series of wire transfers from an offshore shell corporation. It took him weeks of painstakingly tracing digital breadcrumbs, But he finally found the ultimate source of the funds. A holding company owned and controlled by Richard Sterling. The puzzle pieces began to click into place with an alarming clarity. Richard had a connection to the lab's director, a powerful one. Marcus then turned his attention to Anastasia's trust fund. As head of security, he had a certain level of access to company financials. He couldn't see the fine details of the trust, which Richard managed privately, but he could see the quarterly reports that were filed with the main Sterling estate. For years, the fund had been posting suspiciously low returns, often breaking even or reporting minor losses even in booming markets. The official explanation was a conservative investment strategy to preserve capital. Now it looked less like caution and more like a cover for a slow, steady bleed. Marcus sat in his office late one night, the city lights twinkling below, a cold dread settling in his stomach. He had no definitive proof of tampering with the DNA test, only a web of damning coincidences. Richard Sterling had the motive protecting his embezzlement. He had the means, a compromised lab director in his debt. And he had the opportunity. If he was right, then Alexander had been lied to in the most cruel and profound way. He had been robbed of his sister not once but twice. Marcus knew he couldn't go to his boss with mere suspicion. Alexander had closed that door, and to force it open without concrete evidence would be unforgivable. He needed something more. He needed to find the nurse who took the sample, the courier who delivered it. He needed to find a crack in the deception, something to pry it open until the whole rotten structure collapsed. The whispers of the past were growing louder for both the woman who had lost her memory and the man who was paid to protect it. Marcus Vance worked with the quiet, relentless patience of a predator stalking its prey. He started with the courier service his own department used. The records were meticulous. He found the name of the man who transported Evelyn's sample, a reliable ex-Marine named Peterson. Marcus brought him in for an informal chat. Peterson confirmed the pickup from the clinic and the drop-off at Pentec Genetics. He remembered handing the sealed sample directly to a lab technician at the front desk. Everything by the book. The weak link had to be inside the lab. Marcus focused on Dr. Finch. He put a discreet surveillance team on him, tracking his movements, monitoring his communications. For weeks it yielded nothing but the mundane routines of a well-paid professional. But Marcus was patient. He knew men like Finch men, living a lie, always got careless. The break came from an unexpected source, Finch's disgruntled ex-wife. During a bitter divorce proceeding, she had hired a forensic accountant. The accountant digging for hidden assets had flagged a peculiar transaction, a recent large cash deposit into a new private bank account under Finch's name. The deposit was made just 2 days after the DNA results were delivered to Alexander. The amount? $50,000. The exact emotional distress bonus Alexander had authorized for Evelyn. Marcus realized with a jolt of icy fury that Richard hadn't just orchestrated the deception. He'd used Alexander's own money as a down payment for the cover-up. This was the leverage Marcus needed. He cornered Dr. Finch in the parking garage of his exclusive country club. Marcus wasn't wearing a suit. He was dressed in dark, functional clothing, and his calm demeanor had been replaced by an aura of cold, controlled menace. He didn't make threats. He simply laid out the evidence on a tablet, the offshore account, the wire transfers from Richard's shell company, the recent cash deposit, the sworn statement from the courier. Finch crumbled. The carefully constructed facade of the respected scientist shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered man beneath. He confessed everything. He told Marcus how Richard had called him, reminding him of old debts, and instructed him to falsify the report. He admitted to creating the fake results and deleting the raw data from Evelyn's sample. He said it was a mercy. Finch stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. He said Alexander needed closure, that chasing this ghost was destroying him. He said the girl was an opportunist who would ruin the family. Marcus recorded every word. He now had the proof. The web of lies was not just unraveling, it was disintegrating. He immediately drove towards Sterling Tower, the confession a ticking time bomb on his phone. At the same time, Evelyn felt a new, unfamiliar resolve solidifying within her. The locket had become her obsession. She spent hours staring at the boy's stormy eyes, so full of a fierce love for the baby in the other picture. The fragmented lullaby played on a constant loop in her mind. It was more than a clue. It felt like a memory trying to break through a thick wall of fog. She knew the DNA test had said no. She knew the NDA she signed carried the threat of legal action. But she also knew, with a certainty that resonated in her very bones, that the locket in her hand was not a coincidence. It was her history. The truth was more important than the money, more important than the risk. She had to know. She had to look Alexander Sterling in the eye one more time. Putting on her most professional-looking blazer, she took a taxi to the financial district. The Sterling Industries Tower was a monument of black glass and steel that seemed to pierce the clouds. It was designed to intimidate, to proclaim the insignificance of anyone standing at its base. Her old self would have been too terrified to even enter the lobby. But the woman who had fought for her mother's life, who now held a tangible link to her own past, was not her old self. She walked up to the main security desk, her heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm. "I need to see Alexander Sterling," she said, her voice clear and even. The security guard, a hulking man with a bored expression, looked her up and down dismissively. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Evelyn admitted. "But it's a personal matter. It's urgent. Please just tell him that Evelyn Reed is here. And tell him, I have something that belongs to him." The guard was about to brush her off when his earpiece crackled. He listened for a moment, his eyes widening slightly. He looked at Evelyn with a new, confused respect. "Ma'am," he said, his tone changing completely. "Mr. Vance, head of security, says to send you up immediately." The elevator ride to the 80th floor felt like an ascent into another realm. The doors opened into a silent, impossibly pristine reception area. Marcus Vance was waiting for her. His face was grim, but there was a flicker of something new in his eyes as he looked at her. Not pity or suspicion, but a kind of pained anticipation. "Miss Reed," he said. "He's in his office. He doesn't know you're here, but he needs to see you." He led her down a long corridor to a set of massive oak doors. He pushed one open and gestured for her to enter. Alexander was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the door, looking down at the city he owned. He looked thinner, the sharp lines of his suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. The last 6 months had not been kind to him. "Marcus, I told you I wasn't to be disturbed," he said without turning his voice, weary and cold. "There's someone here to see you, sir," Marcus said, his voice taut with emotion. "I strongly advise you to listen to what she has to say." Alexander turned slowly, his face a mask of irritation that instantly froze into disbelief and anger when he saw Evelyn standing there. "Get her out of here," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "She is in violation of a legally binding agreement. I will have her sued for everything she has." Alex. Wait, Marcus pleaded. Just listen. There is nothing to listen to. Alexander's voice rose, cracking with the pain he kept so carefully buried. The test was negative. She is nothing to me. She is a reminder of a mistake I made. Now get her out. Evelyn's courage faltered in the face of his raw fury. Her hands trembled. But then she clutched the locket in her pocket. She took a step forward. The test was wrong, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Alexander let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Of course it was. Let me guess you found some long-lost document. A witness. How much do you want this time? 500,000. 1,000,000. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, tears of frustration and hurt. I don't want your money, she choked out. She pulled the locket from her pocket and held it out her hand, trembling. I think this is yours. Alexander froze, his eyes locked on the small, tarnished piece of silver in her palm. The world seemed to fall away. He recognized it instantly, the specific dent on the side from where he'd dropped it as a boy. The delicate floral engraving his mother had chosen. He had placed it around his baby sister's neck, in the hospital, a gift for the day she was born. He had thought it lost forever in the crash. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his movements stiff, disbelieving. He looked from the locket to her face, a storm of confusion and dawning horror in his eyes. The lie he had forced himself to believe was cracking the truth, pouring through the fissures. And then, under the immense pressure of the moment, the stress and the fear and the desperate, flickering hope, Evelyn did what she always did. She began to hum, a soft, unconscious melody, the wordless lullaby from the depths of her memory. The sound hit Alexander like a physical blow. It was his mother's lullaby, the one she only ever sang to him and Anya, the one he hadn't heard in 20 years, but could still recall every single note of. The unraveling was complete. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was a symphony. The world narrowed to the lullaby humming between them. When Alexander instinctively completed the melody, the final wall of doubt crumbled. The 20-year dam of grief, guilt, and loneliness finally broke. Anya, he wept, his voice raw with a pain and relief, so profound it shook his entire body. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, holding the sister he thought was lost forever. He was no longer a CEO, and she was no longer a waitress. They were family, a fractured whole, finally pieced back together. His sorrow quickly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. He summoned his Uncle Richard to the office. When Richard arrived, he was confronted not only with his long-lost niece, but with a screen displaying irrefutable proof of his decades-long embezzlement from her trust fund and his sabotage of the DNA test. Richard's pathetic pleas for family loyalty were met with cold disdain. "This is my family," Alexander declared, gesturing to Anastasia as police officers entered the room to escort his disgraced uncle away. In the weeks that followed, Anastasia Sterling began to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Alexander ensured her adoptive mother, Sarah, received the best care in the world and began the slow, beautiful process of sharing their family's history. Standing together on his penthouse balcony one evening, she smiled, a new memory surfacing. "I remember you telling me my birthmark was a secret map," she said softly. Alexander looked at his sister, his search finally over a genuine smile transforming his face. It was, he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "to lead you back home." And so a story that began with a shattered glass ends with a family made whole. Alexander Sterling, the man who had everything but the one thing he craved, found his heart again in the sister he thought he had lost forever. And Anastasia, the woman known as Evelyn, discovered a past richer and more loving than she had ever dared to dream. Their journey reminds us that the deepest wounds can be healed, and the most elaborate deceptions will eventually crumble under the weight of truth. It's a testament to the enduring power of family, and the idea that no matter how lost we are, there are threads of connection that can always eventually lead us back home. If this story of reunion and redemption moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a story of hope against all odds, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories to tell, and we want you to be here for every single one. Thank you for listening. What happens when a man with all the money in the world tries to humiliate a woman he thinks has nothing? In the heart of New York City, inside one of its most exclusive restaurants, a billionaire dripping with contempt decided to mock his waitress in a language he assumed she wouldn't understand. He whispered his venom in French, a cruel joke meant for his companion's ears alone. But he made one catastrophic mistake. The waitress, a woman he saw as less than dust, didn't just understand him. She froze, not from fear, but from recognition. And in that moment, she unleashed a secret that would not only shatter his pride, but dismantle his entire empire. The air in Ethelgard wasn't just air. It was a carefully curated atmosphere. It smelled of money, old money to be precise, a subtle blend of lemon oil from the polished mahogany-aged leather from the banquettes, and the faintest, most expensive whisper of truffle oil wafting from the kitchen. From its perch on the 65th floor, the restaurant offered a view of Central Park that was itself a declaration of power. Only the city's elite could afford to look down on the world from such a height. And among the staff who moved like silent phantoms through this gilded cage, there was Clara Moreau. To the patrons, Clara was just part of the scenery. 26 years old, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and dark hair pulled back into a severe professional knot, she was impeccably efficient. Her movements were economical, her smile polite but distant, her presence deliberately unobtrusive. She refilled water glasses before they were half empty and cleared plates with a ghost-like grace. She was in every respect the perfect waitress for a place like Ethelgard, visible only when needed, invisible otherwise. But beneath the starched white shirt and black apron beat the heart of a fallen princess. Clara Moreau wasn't born to serve. She was born to be served. Her father, Jean-Luc Moreau, had been one of the world's most respected art historians and curators, a man whose word could double the value of a Renaissance painting. Her mother, Hélène, was the daughter of a French diplomat, raised in chateaux with sprawling gardens. Clara's childhood had been a whirlwind of museum galas, summers in Provence, and lessons in fencing, piano, and 3 languages. French was not a subject she had learned. It was the language of her lullabies, the tongue in which her parents whispered their love and their arguments. Then 5 years ago, the gilded world had shattered. Jean-Luc Moreau was accused of orchestrating one of the biggest art forgery scandals in modern history. A newly discovered masterpiece, a supposed work by the Dutch master Vermeer, titled The Alchemist's Daughter, was declared authentic on his authority. He staked his entire reputation on it. 6 months later, irrefutable scientific evidence proved it was a brilliant but modern fake. The fallout was catastrophic. Jean-Luc was publicly disgraced, his career obliterated. His friends in high society vanished overnight. The legal fees and penalties devoured their fortune. The man who had once commanded auction houses with a nod was now a pariah. But the true devastation was the accusation itself. He swore he was innocent, that he had been set up, that the evidence against him was manipulated. He pointed fingers at a rival, a man he'd done business with, a ruthless up-and-comer in the corporate world who had a vested interest in the painting's sale. But no one listened. The evidence was stacked, the media narrative was set, and Jean-Luc Moreau was the villain. The stress, the shame, the sheer weight of it all broke him. A massive stroke left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly, his brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. Clara, then just 21, and a promising art history student at Columbia, dropped out to care for him and her heartbroken mother. Hélène, never equipped for hardship, withered. She developed a chronic illness that required expensive medication. The last of their assets were sold off, including their beloved brownstone. Clara took the first job she could get that paid well enough to cover the rent on their cramped Queen's apartment and her mother's prescriptions, a waitress at Ethelgard. It was a bitter irony. Every night she served the same kind of people who had once been her family's peers, the people who had turned their backs on them without a second thought. She listened to them boast about their acquisitions and summer homes, her face a mask of polite servitude, her soul burning with a cold, quiet rage. Her only confidant at the restaurant was Sophia, another waitress with a sharp tongue and a kind heart. "I don't know how you do it, Clara," Sophia said one evening as they polished silverware in the back. "You have the patience of a saint. If Mr. Henderson from table 4 clicked his fingers at me one more time, I was going to stab him with a butter knife." Clara offered a faint smile. "Patience is a weapon, Soph. You just have to know when to use it." She held up a fork, inspecting it for smudges. The reflection showed a tired-looking young woman, but her eyes held a fire that no amount of hardship had been able to extinguish. She wasn't just waiting tables, she was waiting for a chance, any chance to reclaim her father's honor. That chance was about to walk through the door. It was a Tuesday night, typically slower, but a reservation had been made under a name that sent a ripple of energy through the staff, Damien Sterling. Mr. Dubois, the severe French manager who ran Ethelgard with military precision, briefed the staff. "Mr. Sterling is one of the most important investors in the restaurant group. He is particular. Everything must be perfect. No mistakes. Clara, you will take the table. Your professionalism is unmatched." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. She knew the name. Damien Sterling was a titan of finance, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from nothing. His face was a regular feature in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He was known for his aggressive takeovers, his lavish lifestyle, and his notoriously short temper. He was the epitome of new money, desperate to cloak himself in the trappings of the old world. When he arrived, he was exactly as she'd pictured. Tall, impeccably dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit with a ridiculously expensive Patek Philippe watch on his wrist that seemed to scream its own price tag. His hair was perfectly coiffed, and his smile was a predatory slash of white teeth. On his arm was a woman who looked more like an accessory than a person, stunningly beautiful, painfully thin, and wearing a dress that cost more than Clara's annual rent. Her name was Isabel. Sterling party of 2. He announced to the hostess, not with the tone of a guest arriving, but of a king entering his court. They were seated at the best table, the corner banquette, with the panoramic view. It fell within Clara's section. As she approached, she felt a familiar knot of resentment tighten in her stomach. He was just another arrogant peacock, another man who saw her as nothing more than a pair of hands to bring him his food. "Good evening," Clara said, her voice calm and even. "My name is Clara, and I will be your server this evening. May I start you with some water?" Damien didn't even look at her. He was busy showing Isabel something on his phone. He simply waved a dismissive hand. "Get us the 98 Petrus, and don't shake it." It was an order, not a request. Clara knew the wine. It was $12,000 a bottle. "An excellent choice, sir," she said, maintaining her composure. She turned to Isabel. "And for you, madam." Isabel looked up from the phone, momentarily confused, as if she hadn't expected to be spoken to. "Oh, I'll have what he's having." As Clara walked towards the wine cellar, she could hear Damien's voice, a low rumble of arrogance. He was boasting about a recent acquisition, a rival company he'd gutted and sold for parts. He spoke of people's livelihoods as if they were numbers on a spreadsheet. Clara returned with the wine, presenting it to him, as per protocol. He glanced at the label with a cursory nod, the gesture of a man performing a role he'd learned from movies. "Open it." She performed the ritual with practiced expertise, the clean cut of the foil, the silent twist of the corkscrew, the perfect pour into the decanter. Her hands were steady, betraying none of the contempt she felt. She poured a small amount for him to taste. He swirled it, sniffed it with an exaggerated air of a connoisseur, and took a sip. "Acceptable," he declared, as if he were granting the wine a pardon. For the next hour, Clara served them in near silence, moving in and out of their bubble of wealth and privilege. They ignored her completely, their conversation revolving around yachts, galas, and the vapid gossip of their social circle. Damien did most of the talking, his voice a constant stream of self-aggrandizement. Then he ordered the beluga caviar, another ostentatious display. As Clara placed the mother-of-pearl spoons on the table, Damien glanced at her for the first time, but his eyes didn't see a person. They saw an object, a prop in his performance. He leaned towards Isabel, a conspiratorial smirk on his face. He lowered his voice, believing he was creating a private, impenetrable space between them. And then he began to speak in French, a language he clearly thought was his secret weapon, a mark of his superior culture. His accent was atrocious, a clumsy, butchered version of the beautiful language Clara had grown up with. But the words were clear as a bell. "Regarde cette pauvre petite chose," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at this poor little thing. Elle travaille si dur pour quelques miettes. She works so hard for a few crumbs. Je me demande si elle a jamais goûté à quelque chose de meilleur que les restes de la cuisine. I wonder if she's ever tasted anything better than scraps from the kitchen." Isabel giggled a high-pitched, vacuous sound. "Oh, Damien, you're awful." "C'est la vie, mon chou," he continued, thoroughly enjoying himself. "That's life, my sweet. Il y a nous, et puis il y a eux. There are people like us, and then there are people like them. She probably lives in some miserable little box in a borough I wouldn't even drive through." Clara stood perfectly still. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the soft jazz from the speakers faded into a dull roar in her ears. Her breath caught in her chest. Every muscle in her body went rigid. It wasn't just the insult. She'd heard worse, endured worse. It was something else. It was his voice, that specific cadence of arrogance. It was the mention of people like us and people like them. It was a phrase that echoed in the dark recesses of her memory. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and a scene from 5 years ago flashed through her mind. Her father, his face pale with fury, standing in his study after a phone call. That man, he had seethed to her mother. That man, Damien Sterling. He thinks there are 2 types of people in this world. People like us, he said, and people like them. And he believes he can buy and sell people like them for sport. Damien Sterling. the man who had been her father's business partner in the Vermeer deal, the man her father had accused of setting him up, the man whose name had been a curse whispered in her house for 5 long years. He was here, mocking her, in her mother's native tongue. The blood drained from her face and then rushed back with the force of a tidal wave. The silver tray in her hand felt impossibly heavy. The world narrowed to this one man, this one table. The years of quiet suffering, of swallowed pride, of seeing her family destroyed, coalesced into a single white-hot point of clarity. This wasn't just an insult. This was destiny. Damien, oblivious, took another sip of his obscenely expensive wine. He looked up at her, expecting to see the blank, servile expression of a nobody. He saw her freeze. He saw the color shift in her face. He smirked, assuming his French had somehow registered as a foreign, confusing sound, making the little waitress malfunction. He was about to make another cutting remark to Isabelle, but he never got the chance. Clara's posture straightened. She lifted her chin, and the subservient mask she had worn for 5 years dissolved, replaced by an expression of cold, aristocratic fury. The humble waitress vanished, and in her place stood the daughter of Jean-Luc and Hélène Moreau. She leaned forward, not enough to be improper, but enough to command his full attention. Her voice, when it came out, was not the quiet, deferential tone of a server. It was low, flawless, and resonant with the pure Parisian accent of the French elite, an accent that made his own attempt sound like nails on a chalkboard. "Monsieur," she began the single word, cutting through the air like a shard of ice. Damien Sterling's smirk faltered. His eyes widened slightly. Isabelle stopped giggling. Clara continued, her sea-storm eyes locked on his. "Si vous souhaitez critiquer ma situation en français, je vous suggère d'abord de maîtriser la langue au-delà du niveau d'un touriste cherchant les toilettes. If you wish to critique my circumstances in French, I suggest you first master the language beyond the level of a tourist asking for the bathroom." Damien's jaw went slack. The wine glass in his hand trembled. He was utterly, completely frozen. He understood every single perfectly enunciated word. But Clara wasn't finished. She pressed her advantage, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with venom. "Votre accent est aussi maladroit que vos manières. Et quant à ce que j'ai goûté ou non, sachez que j'ai été élevé dans un monde dont vous ne faites que porter le costume. Your accent is as clumsy as your manners. And as for what I have or have not tasted, know that I was raised in a world for which you only wear the costume." She held his stunned, panicked gaze for a beat longer, letting the weight of her words land. The silence at the table was absolute. Isabelle looked back and forth between them, her face a mask of complete confusion. Then, with a poise that was nothing short of breathtaking, Clara straightened up, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and said in perfect professional English, "Please enjoy your caviar, sir." And she turned and walked away, her back ramrod straight, leaving Damien Sterling sitting in the ruins of his own arrogance, his face a ghastly shade of pale. He wasn't just mocked, he was exposed, and in his eyes, Clara saw something more than just humiliation. She saw fear. He hadn't just been outsmarted by a waitress. He had been recognized by a ghost from the past he thought he had buried forever. The walk from Damien Sterling's table to the sanctuary of the kitchen felt like traversing a chasm. Clara's legs moved on autopilot, her mind a maelstrom. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made her hands tremble, but her resolve was forged in steel. She pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic symphony of the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the hiss of the grill, the shouted orders of the chefs, and it was like coming up for air after being held underwater. Sophia was by the service station, inputting an order. She took one look at Clara's face, and her eyes widened. "Clara, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Clara breathed, leaning against the cold stainless steel counter. "I've seen a monster." Before she could explain, the kitchen door swung open with such force that it slammed against the rubber stopper. Mr. Dubois, the manager, stood in the doorway, his normally placid face a thundercloud. His eyes scanned the kitchen and locked onto Clara. "Moreau, my office. Now," he barked. A hush fell over the kitchen staff. A summons to Dubois' office mid-shift meant one thing: termination. Sophia shot Clara a panicked look. Clara, however, felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. Getting fired was the least of her worries now. Everything had changed. She followed Dubois into his cramped, windowless office. He closed the door behind them and gestured sharply to the chair opposite his desk. He sat down, steepled his fingers, and fixed her with a hard stare. "Explain," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Mr. Sterling is one of our most significant patrons. He has just informed the hostess that he is leaving, that he has been egregiously insulted by his server, and that he will be speaking to the ownership group tomorrow morning. He demands your immediate dismissal. So I will ask you one time, Clara. What did you do?" Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I spoke to him in French." Dubois' eyebrows shot up. As a native of Lyon, he was proud of his heritage. "You spoke to him in French? What could you possibly have said in French to provoke such a reaction?" This was the moment. She could lie down, play it, try to save her job, or she could tell the truth. The choice was easy. "He was speaking about me to his companion." Clara began, her voice steady. "He assumed because I am a waitress that I was uneducated and would not understand. He called me a poor little thing who survives on scraps from the kitchen. He mocked my presumed social status. His French was, to be frank, atrocious." Dubois listened, his expression shifting from anger to intense curiosity. "And your reply?" "My reply," Clara said, her voice taking on the same icy precision she had used at the table, "was delivered in the French my mother taught me. I suggested that if he wished to insult someone in a language, he should endeavor to learn it properly first. I told him his accent was as clumsy as his manners, and I informed him that I was raised in the world he merely pretends to be a part of." A long silence filled the small office. Mr. Dubois stared at her, not as a manager looking at an errant employee, but as a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, unreadable expression dawning on his face. He had always recognized a certain refinement in Clara, a grace that went beyond mere professional training. Now the pieces were clicking into place. "Moreau," he said, her surname sounding different now, more formal. "What is your story?" "My father is Jean-Luc Moreau," she said simply. The name landed in the room with the weight of a dropped statue. Dubois' eyes widened in recognition. Anyone in the world of high culture, especially a Frenchman like himself, knew that name. Jean-Luc Moreau, the brilliant curator, the tragic scandal. "Mon Dieu," Dubois breathed, looking at her as if for the first time. "The art historian." "The same," Clara confirmed. "And Damien Sterling is the man who destroyed him. He was my father's partner on the Vermeer deal. My father was convinced Sterling framed him, silencing him, just as he was about to expose the painting as a forgery himself. Sterling bought the masterpiece for a pittance after the scandal, and it now hangs in his private collection as a trophy of his victory." The full horrifying scope of the evening's confrontation settled upon Dubois. It wasn't a waitress snapping at a rude customer. It was an act of long-simmering justice. It was a daughter defending her father's honor against the very man who had ruined him. He was quiet for a long time, tapping a pen on his desk. "Mr. Sterling has immense power," he said, finally his voice now laced with concern. "He could cause significant trouble for this restaurant. For me. For you." "I know," Clara said. "I'm prepared to leave. I understand the position I've put you in." Dubois shook his head slowly. "No, you don't understand." He stood up and walked to the door. He opened it and looked out at the bustling kitchen, then back at her. "For 5 years I have run this establishment based on a single principle: excellence. Mr. Sterling, for all his money, is a vulgar man who appreciates only the price of things, not their value. He ordered a 98 Petrus and drank it like it was grape juice." He let out a short, sharp sigh. "You, Mademoiselle Moreau, possess a quality that money cannot buy. Class, integrity." He looked her straight in the eye. "To hell with Damien Sterling. You are not fired. Take the rest of the night off, on full pay. Go home and be with your family." Clara was stunned into silence. She had expected dismissal, not solidarity. A wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes, washed over her. "Monsieur, I thank you." "Nonsense," he said with a dismissive wave, though a flicker of a smile touched his lips. "He insulted you in my native tongue. Consider it a matter of national pride." He paused. "And Clara, be careful. A man like Sterling, when humiliated, does not simply walk away. He retaliates." Clara left Ethelgard and stepped out into the cool night air of Columbus Circle. The city lights, usually a source of oppressive anonymity, seemed to sparkle with possibility tonight. The confrontation had been like a lightning strike, illuminating a path forward that had been shrouded in darkness for 5 long years. Her father's words echoed in her mind: "Patience is a weapon, but it is useless without a target." Tonight, she had found her target. The subway ride to Queens was a blur. When she arrived at their small 3rd-floor walk-up, the smell of lavender and old books greeted her. She found her mother, Helene, asleep in an armchair in the living room, a thin blanket pulled over her lap, an open book of French poetry resting on her chest. Helene looked so fragile, a pale shadow of the vibrant woman she once was. Clara gently took the book, placed a bookmark in it, and draped the blanket more securely around her mother's shoulders. The sight of her mother's quiet suffering solidified the new, dangerous resolve taking root in her heart. In the small room that served as her father's bedroom and study, she found him awake, sitting in his wheelchair by the window, looking out at the brick wall of the adjacent building. The stroke had stolen his words, but not the intelligence in his eyes. He turned his head as she entered, and his gaze was sharp, questioning. He could always tell when something was wrong, or in this case, when something was different. She knelt by his wheelchair, taking his good hand in hers. "Papa," she said softly. "I saw him tonight. Damien Sterling." Her father's hand convulsed in hers. A low, guttural sound of frustration and rage escaped his lips, one of the few sounds he could still make. His eyes burned with a fire she hadn't seen in years. "He was at the restaurant," Clara continued, her voice low and intense. "He tried to humiliate me. He didn't know who I was, but I knew who he was. And Papa, I didn't stay silent." She recounted the entire exchange, word for word, in French. As she spoke, she watched her father's face. The frustration gave way to shock, then to something else, a fierce, blazing pride. A single tear tracked its way down his wrinkled cheek. When she finished, he squeezed her hand with surprising strength, his eyes conveying everything his voice could not good. "It has begun." For the first time in 5 years, Clara felt not like a victim of circumstance, but an agent of her own destiny. Dubois' warning echoed in her head. A man like Sterling retaliates. She knew this wasn't the end. It was the opening salvo of a war she had just declared. Sterling wouldn't just try to get her fired now, he would try to crush her. He couldn't afford to have a ghost with the name Moreau walking around New York, especially one who wasn't afraid of him. She went to her own small room and pulled out a worn, leather-bound trunk from under her bed. Inside was the wreckage of her former life photographs, university textbooks, and at the very bottom, a collection of her father's notebooks. These weren't his published works, but his private research journals, filled with his elegant looping script detailing his thoughts, his discoveries, his doubts. She had packed them away because looking at them was too painful. Now she opened them with a new purpose. She spent the rest of the night poring over the entries from the months leading up to the scandal. She read about his initial excitement over The Alchemist's Daughter, his meticulous examination of the canvas, the pigments, the craquelure. And then she found it. An entry dated 2 weeks before the scandal broke. Her father's handwriting was agitated sharper than usual. "Something is wrong with the lead tin yellow," he had written. "The particle composition, it's too uniform, almost unnaturally so. It's consistent with the 17th century, but it lacks the subtle, almost imperceptible inclusions of silica one would expect from the milling process of the era. It feels manufactured, perfect in a way that feels false." She read on her heart, pounding. "I raised my preliminary concerns with Damien today. He dismissed them out of hand. 'You're being paranoid, Jean-Luc,' he said. 'This is our golden goose. Don't ruin it with academic fussiness.' His eagerness to rush to authentication is unseemly. It feels less like passion for the art and more like pure avarice. He's already pre-sold shares in the painting to a consortium of investors. If this painting is revealed as a fake before the public sale, he will be ruined and exposed as a fraud." The final chilling entry on the subject was from 2 days before his public disgrace. "I am certain now. It's a forgery. A masterful one, but a forgery nonetheless. There's a particular technique in the underdrawing of the girl's sleeve, a cross-hatching style that is a signature of a known 20th century forger, Han van Meegeren's most gifted student. I have a sample ready to send for independent spectrographic analysis. I will confront Damien with my full findings tomorrow morning. The truth must come out." He never got the chance. The next day, an anonymous tip led investigators to a Swiss bank account, opened in her father's name, with a multi-million-dollar deposit traced back to the sellers of the painting. The independent analysis he had commissioned was mysteriously intercepted and replaced with a doctored report confirming the painting's authenticity. He was framed perfectly and completely. Clara closed the journal, her hands shaking. This was it. This was the proof. It wasn't just her father's word against Sterling's. It was his contemporaneous documented research. Sterling hadn't just profited from the scandal. He had orchestrated it to stop her father from exposing him. He'd pre-sold shares in a painting he knew might be fake, a massive act of fraud. A cold, hard plan began to form in her mind. A public confrontation was not enough. Humiliating him was not enough. She had to dismantle him. She had to take away everything he had built on the ashes of her family's name. And she knew just how to do it. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Sophia. Dubois just got off the phone. Said it was the big boss. "You're not fired, but you're on indefinite paid leave. He said to tell you to lay low." Sounds more like a warning to me. Be careful, C. Lay low. It was good advice. It was also advice she had no intention of taking. Laying low was what she had done for 5 years. The time for hiding was over. The time for hunting had begun. She looked at her father's journal, then at her own reflection in the dark window. The waitress was gone. In her place was Clara Moreau, and she was coming for Damien Sterling with a weapon far more powerful than money, the truth. The indefinite paid leave was a gilded cage, a temporary sanctuary bought by Mr. Dubois' courage. Clara knew it wouldn't last. Damien Sterling was not a man to forgive or forget a public humiliation. He would investigate the waitress who had so thoroughly flayed him. He would dig until he unearthed the name Moreau, and the moment he did, his fear would ignite a far more dangerous fire. Her time was running out. She didn't waste a second. Her cramped Queen's apartment became the headquarters of a one-woman insurgency. The years of quiet grief were over, replaced by a cold, energizing fury. She unearthed the leather trunk containing the last vestiges of her father's academic life, his private research journals. For 5 years they had been monuments to her pain. Now they were an arsenal. With a methodical focus she hadn't felt since her university days, she devoured the entries from the months leading up to the scandal. She read of her father's initial awe at The Alchemist's Daughter, his meticulous notes on its composition, and then the dawning, sickening realization that something was wrong. She found the key passage, the one that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Her father's script sharp with agitation. Something is wrong with the lead tin yellow. It lacks the subtle inclusions of silica. It feels manufactured. I raised my concerns with Damien today. He dismissed them. "This is our golden goose, Jean-Luc," he said. "Don't ruin it." His avarice is alarming. He has already pre-sold shares in the painting to investors. If this is a fake, he isn't just a fool. He's a fraud. The final entry, dated just 2 days before his public ruin, was the smoking gun. I am certain now. It's a forgery. A masterful one, but a forgery. The underdrawing of the sleeve, it contains a cross-hatching style, a signature of a known 20th century forger. I have a sample ready for independent analysis. I will confront Damien with my full findings tomorrow. Clara closed the journal, her hands trembling, not with fear, but with vindication. This was the proof. Her father was on the verge of exposing Sterling's massive financial fraud when Sterling had framed him, turning the truth on its head. But a journal, however damning, wasn't enough. It was her word, the word of a bitter daughter, against a billionaire's. She needed an ally, someone with unimpeachable credibility, someone known for hunting monsters like Sterling. Her mind immediately seized on one name, Arthur Finch. A lion of investigative journalism, Finch had been forced into retirement from the New York Ledger, but his reputation for dismantling corrupt financiers was legendary. Crucially, she remembered a single skeptical article he'd written about her father's case years ago, questioning the convenient perfection of the narrative against him. He had seen the masterpiece of misdirection. Finding him was a challenge. He was a ghost in the digital age. An old press club directory finally led her to a dusty, cavernous bookstore in the East Village called The Final Word. A small bell announced her entry into a maze of towering, precarious stacks of books. Behind a counter that served as a fortress against the world sat a man with rumpled clothes, thinning grey hair, and the deeply cynical eyes of someone who had seen humanity's worst. "We close in 5 minutes," he grumbled, not bothering to look up from his newspaper. "Mr. Finch," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Clara Moreau. My father was Jean-Luc Moreau." The newspaper lowered slowly. Arthur Finch's pale blue eyes, magnified by his spectacles, appraised her with piercing intensity. I remember the name. The story's old and cold. "What do you want?" "I want to reignite it." she replied, stepping forward and placing her father's journal on the counter between them. This is his private journal from right before the scandal. It proves he knew the Vermeer was a fake. It proves Damien Sterling had a multi-million-dollar motive to silence him and frame him. Finch's bored facade cracked, replaced by the keen, predatory interest of a reporter smelling blood. He opened the journal with a reverence for evidence that Clara deeply appreciated. His finger traced the elegant script. "A diary can be dismissed," he rasped, testing her. "Sterling will claim your father wrote it after the fact to save himself." "He had a stroke 5 years ago, Mr. Finch. He hasn't been able to write his own name since," Clara countered coolly. "The entries are dated. They are his real-time thoughts. And more importantly, he mentions a specific piece of evidence, a forger's signature hidden in the underdrawing of the painting. That was the hook." Finch leaned in the old fire rekindling in his eyes. "Okay, kid, you've got my undivided attention. But to nail a man like Sterling, we need more than a book. We need a public stage, and we need a cannonball of irrefutable proof to fire from it." "I have the stage," Clara said instantly, the plan that had been forming in her mind, now crystallizing. "In 2 weeks, Sterling is hosting his annual Patron's Heart Gala. It's his biggest night of self-promotion, and the auction centerpiece this year is a charcoal sketch, a supposed study for the alchemist's daughter." Finch let out a low, appreciative whistle. The sheer, unmitigated gall. He's not just polishing his trophy, he's selling tickets to see it. It's the perfect stage for an implosion. He paused, his gaze hardening. "But what's the cannonball? The signature you mentioned is on the actual painting, which is hanging in his penthouse. We need to see it. We need forensic quality images." The challenge seemed insurmountable. Sterling's penthouse was a fortress, but a sly, calculating smile spread across Arthur's face. His ego may be his undoing. He's desperate for legitimacy. So desperate he just hired a new private curator to catalogue his collection. A brilliant but hopelessly naive academic named Dr. Alistair Finch. Clara stared. "Finch?" "My nephew," Arthur confirmed with a grimace, "thinks his Uncle Arthur is a journalistic troglodyte. But he's family, and he's about to unwittingly help us commit a beautiful act of sabotage." The plan they hatched was as simple as it was audacious. Arthur would leverage a vague family obligation to have Alistair hire a specialist for his cataloguing project. Clara would become Anna, a freelance art photographer and research assistant with a stellar and fabricated portfolio. Her sole mission, infiltrate the lion's den and capture high-resolution, multispectral images of the forgery's hidden signature. The next 10 days were a blur of transformation. Clara shed the skin of the waitress and the grieving daughter. Using the last of her funds, she acquired a new uniform, understated intellectual, and expensive enough to pass muster. She spent hours in the New York Public Library, refreshing her knowledge on art forensics and photographic techniques, becoming Anna in mind as well as appearance. In a moment of calculated risk, she sent a heavily encrypted message to Dr. Isabella Rossi, her father's most trusted colleague in Florence, a world-renowned expert in pigment analysis. The message was simple. "Found father's notes. Proof is coming. Stand by." The reply was instantaneous for Jean-Luc, always. The day of the visit, a knot of pure ice formed in Clara's stomach. Arthur met her for coffee, his usual cynicism replaced by a paternal concern. "Remember you are Anna," he coached. "Professional, quiet, detached. Sterling will be there preening over his possessions. He is your target, but he cannot know it. Get the pictures and get out." Sterling's penthouse was exactly as she'd imagined, a sterile monument to wealth on Billionaires' Row. It was less a home than a private gallery of financial conquests, with masterpieces by Rothko and Bacon hanging like hostages on vast white walls. And there, dominating the central living space, was the beautiful lie itself, the alchemist's daughter. Seeing it in person sent a jolt through her, a mixture of revulsion and awe at the forger's skill. Damian Sterling, dressed in a ludicrously expensive cashmere tracksuit, greeted them with the bored air of a king receiving tribute. Arthur's nephew Alistair, a nervous young man swimming in a tweed jacket, made the introductions. "Mr. Sterling, this is Anna, the photographic documentarian I hired. Her work is first-rate." Sterling's cold reptilian eyes swept over Clara. It was a moment of supreme terror. Would he see her, the waitress from Ethelgard? The woman who had gutted his pride with a few perfectly spoken words of French? He saw nothing. He saw a plain, scholarly woman who posed no threat, another hired hand to be ignored. "Fine," he grunted, already turning back to a massive screen displaying stock tickers. "Alistair, supervise her. Make sure she doesn't touch anything." The dismissal was a gift. It allowed Clara to fade into her role. With trembling insides but rock-steady hands, she began her work, methodically photographing several pieces to establish her cover. She could feel Sterling watching her intermittently from across the room, his gaze not one of suspicion, but of smug ownership, as an expert validated his collection. The irony was suffocating. She saved The Alchemist's Daughter for last. Given its provenance, I'll need to use multispectral imaging to create a full record for the insurance catalogue, she explained to Alistair, her voice a flat, academic monotone. "Brilliant, of course," he replied, eager to contribute. This was the moment. She adjusted her powerful camera and tripod fitting the infrared lens. She focused on the sleeve of the girl's dress, the very spot her father's journal had described. Through the viewfinder, the painted surface was opaque. But on her camera's small digital screen, which processed the infrared light, the ghostly underdrawing began to appear. Her heart hammered. And then she saw it. Faint but absolutely clear. A specific geometric cross-hatching pattern in the folds of the fabric, a stylistic tick as unique as a fingerprint. It was the forger's signature. She had him. She took a dozen shots from every conceivable angle her movements practiced, and calm. The evidence was now digital, captured secure. She downloaded the files to an encrypted drive and then wiped the camera's memory card clean as Alistair looked on oblivious. As she packed her gear, Sterling sauntered over, a proprietary gleam in his eye. "Impressive, isn't it?" he said, gesturing to the painting. "My Vermeer." The temptation to strike, to wipe that smirk off his face with a single sentence, was overwhelming. But she held his gaze, her face a perfect mask of professional detachment. She was Anna. "It's a most compelling painting, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. "A truly fascinating subject for technical analysis." It was the perfect, bloodless response music to his arrogant ears. He nodded, satisfied that his possession had been appropriately admired, and dismissed her with a wave. Clara walked out of that penthouse and into the New York afternoon, the encrypted drive in her pocket feeling like a detonator. She had walked into the heart of her enemy's fortress, looked him in the eye, and stolen the secret that would bring his entire world crashing down. The ghost had gathered her proof. Now it was time to set the stage for the haunting. The fortnight leading to the Patron's Heart Gala was a period of intense, focused activity. Arthur Finch's bookstore, The Final Word, transformed from a dusty sanctuary of old knowledge into a clandestine war room. The air, usually thick with the scent of aging paper, now crackled with conspiracy, and the hum of a laser printer churning out evidence. The encrypted drive containing the images from Sterling's penthouse was their primary asset, and they prepared to leverage it with the precision of a military strike. The first move was to send the multispectral images to Dr. Isabella Rossi in Florence. Working through secure channels, the fiercely loyal art historian analyzed the data with a passion fueled by her belief in Jean-Luc Moreau's innocence. The report she sent back less than 72 hours later was more than just a confirmation. It was an executioner's warrant. Dr. Rossi's analysis not only corroborated the chemical anomalies in the pigments her father had first noted, but it also presented a side-by-side comparison of the infrared underdrawing from The Alchemist's Daughter with known works by a specific 20th century forger. The match was perfect, the stylistic signature undeniable. Her conclusion was stated with absolute scientific certainty. The painting was a modern fake. The cannonball was now forged and ready. While Clara absorbed the report, steeling her resolve, Arthur worked his own magic. He became a ghost in the machine, calling in favors from a lifetime of journalistic integrity. He prepared a comprehensive press kit containing Dr. Rossi's findings, key excerpts from Jean-Luc's journal, and a timeline of the original scandal ready for instantaneous digital release. He made discreet calls to trusted contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the District Attorney's Office, not revealing his hand, but advising them to pay very close attention to Damien Sterling's gala auction. Think of it as a potential philanthropic anomaly, he'd said, his voice laced with intrigue. His final preparations involved coaching Clara. You cannot go in there as a vengeful daughter, he instructed her, pacing the cramped back room. Emotion is Sterling's weapon. He will paint you as hysterical. You must be cold, factual, and unshakable. You are not there to accuse. You are there to present incontrovertible facts. You are an art historian just like your father. You will honor him with his own weapon, the truth. Clara understood. This required one last transformation. She couldn't be the waitress nor the timid academic, Anna. She had to embody the legacy Sterling had tried to erase. With the funds from Mr. Dubois and a loan from Arthur, she procured her armor, a vintage sapphire blue silk gown. It was a statement of timeless elegance, not fleeting wealth. Her hair was swept into a graceful chignon, her only jewelry, a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. When she looked at her reflection, she saw the woman she was meant to be, her stormy eyes, burning with a purpose that left no room for fear. The night of the gala, the Temple of Dender at the Metropolitan Museum, was a shimmering spectacle of performative charity. The air was heavy with expensive perfume and the self-congratulatory chatter of New York's elite. Clara moved through the crowd, a ghost of their world they failed to recognize. They saw only an elegant stranger, not the daughter of the man they had so easily condemned. She saw them for what they were, courtiers to a hollow king. And there was the king himself, Damien Sterling, holding court near the stage. He was incandescent with pride, accepting praise for his generosity, his trophy girlfriend Isabel glittering with diamonds on his arm. He looked untouchable, a man so insulated by his wealth he believed himself immune to consequence. Clara took a glass of champagne, the cool stem grounding her. She found Arthur near the edge of the room, looking wonderfully out of place in his rumpled suit. He gave her a single, sharp nod. The signal. After a series of fawning speeches, Sterling took the stage himself, bathing in the warm glow of the spotlight and applause. "It is the greatest honor of my life to support the arts," he purred into the microphone. "And in that spirit I am delighted to offer a truly special piece from my personal collection for tonight's auction." An assistant unveiled the charcoal sketch, The Study for the Alchemist's Daughter. The auctioneer began his rapid-fire chant, and the bidding war commenced. It was a frenzy of ego hands shooting up across the room, the price climbing into the hundreds of thousands. With every bid, the lie was reinforced, Sterling's fraud gilded with another layer of public validation. He watched a smug smile plastered on his face. This was his moment of ultimate triumph. The bidding hit $500,000. Sold to the gentleman in the third row. The auctioneer was about to cry, his gavel raised. Wait! The word, though spoken at a normal volume, sliced through the hall's acoustics with the clarity of a ringing bell. The gavel froze mid-air. The auctioneer faltered. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd as every head turned to find the source of the interruption. Clara Moreau stepped out from the shadows of a column, the light catching the deep blue of her dress. She moved forward, her gaze locked on the man on the stage. Sterling squinted, annoyed. "I'm sorry, madam, this is a private event." "I am aware," Clara said, her voice steady and resonant as she continued her deliberate walk towards the stage. The crowd instinctively parted for her. "My name is Clara Moreau." The name landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp followed by an explosion of whispers swept the room. Moreau, Jean-Luc Moreau's daughter. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, turned to chalk. The blood drained from his face as he stared at the ghost who had come to haunt his feast. "I am Jean-Luc Moreau's daughter," she announced, her voice rising to fill the sudden silence. "And as an art historian, I have a professional and moral duty to inform everyone here of the true nature of the item you are bidding on." "Security," Sterling hissed, his composure shattering. "Remove this woman immediately. She's deranged." 2 guards started towards her, but Arthur Finch moved to intercept them, flashing his old press credentials like a shield. "She has a right to be heard," he stated with quiet authority. Clara paid them no mind. Her entire focus was on Sterling. "This sketch," she declared, pointing a graceful hand towards the easel, "is not a glimpse into the mind of a 17th century master. It is a modern accessory to an elaborate multi-million-dollar fraud." "You're insane," Sterling shouted, his voice cracking. "A bitter girl trying to slander my name to avenge your criminal father." "My father was not a criminal," Clara shot back, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. "He was a man of integrity who was silenced. He was framed by the one person who stood to lose everything if the real truth came out. A man who had already committed massive fraud by pre-selling shares in a painting he was privately being warned was a fake. That man was you, Mr. Sterling." She raised her phone, and on the large screens flanking the stage, an image appeared, a page from her father's journal, his elegant script detailing his suspicions. As the crowd murmured, she swiped, and the next image appeared, the stark black and white infrared photograph of the sleeve, the forger's unique cross-hatching, circled in red. "My father knew the forger had left a signature, a stylistic tick hidden beneath the paint," she explained, her voice clinical and precise. A signature he was about to expose. "This is it." The next slide was a side-by-side comparison from Dr. Rossi's report, placing the infrared image next to a known sample from the 20th century forger. The patterns were identical. This is not Vermeer. It is a lie authenticated by a report from one of the world's leading experts, Dr. Isabella Rossi. Sterling was cornered, his face slick with sweat. "Lies. This is all fake doctored images, slander." He roared, but his denials were hollow, drowned out by the weight of the evidence on the screens. "Is it?" Clara asked softly. And then came the final devastating blow. From the side of the stage, a pale, trembling figure emerged. It was Alistair Finch, Arthur's nephew, his face a mask of horrified resolution held up a tablet. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice shaking but clear enough for the microphone to catch. "Your own financial records, which I am charged with maintaining, show a payment of $2 million to a shell corporation. The payment was made 2 days before Dr. Moreau was publicly accused. That shell corporation has been traced back to the firm that produced the fraudulent authentication report used to frame him. If the art historical evidence was a dagger, this was the poison on its tip. The accusation was no longer just about a fake painting. It was about conspiracy wire fraud and a criminal plot to destroy an innocent man. The entire room erupted. The facade of civility crumbled. Sterling stood alone on the stage, a pariah under the hot lights, his powerful friends physically recoiling from him. His empire of lies had dissolved in a matter of minutes. As he stood there, speechless and exposed, the main doors of the hall swung open. 2 uniformed officers and 2 detectives in sharp suits entered, not with urgency, but with the calm, inexorable purpose of fate. They walked directly towards the stage, their eyes fixed on one man. Clara watched them approach. She felt no elation, only a profound, solemn quiet. Her quest was over. The sword she had forged from truth had done its work. The ghost had finally brought the monster into the light. In the end, it wasn't a clash of titans. It was a story of quiet, unyielding truth against loud, hollow arrogance. Clara Moreau, the woman Damien Sterling saw as nothing, became his everything, his judge, his jury, and the architect of his downfall. Sterling was arrested that night, his empire collapsing under the weight of dozens of fraud investigations. The name Jean-Luc Moreau was not only cleared, but celebrated his genius and integrity finally vindicated. Clara, no longer a waitress or a ghost, used her family's reclaimed legacy to establish a foundation dedicated to fighting art fraud and supporting artists, ensuring no one would suffer the way her father did. Her story is a powerful reminder that wealth can build palaces, but it can never build character. True power lies not in what you have, but in who you are and the courage you have to defend it. If you are cheering for Clara's incredible victory, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story of justice served cold. Let us know in the comments what you think was the most satisfying moment of Damien Sterling's downfall. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more unforgettable stories of unexpected heroes and righteous revenge.